It all began on a scorching July afternoon in the quiet suburban enclave of Lakewood Meadows, a place that seemed ordinary on the surface with its manicured lawns, neatly painted shutters, and uniform driveways, but beneath that picture perfect, postcard image brewed a storm that no resident could have imagined. For the Homeowners Association that presided over the neighborhood was not just obsessed with rules about mailbox heights, grass lengths, or where you parked your truck. They had recently taken advantage of a new legal loophole that allowed them to directly contract local sheriffs and constables for security, effectively granting them the ability to act like a private police force, and the man who first discovered just how dangerous that power could be was David Harmon, a veteran who had moved into Lakewood Meadows for peace and recovery after serving 2 tours overseas, buying a modest ranch-style home on the corner of Willow Bend with the little savings he had and the hope that this neighborhood, quiet and well-kept, would give him stability. But stability was the last thing he found, because within days of moving in, the HOA sent him letters about his truck being too large, his American flag being improperly displayed, and his dogs barking being a public nuisance. And while these seemed like typical HOA overreaches, what set this situation apart was that instead of fines or nasty grams, uniformed deputies showed up at his door holding HOA violation tickets, like they were legal summons. Their cruiser lights flashing, their radios crackling, and their badges gleaming under the sun as though David had committed a crime, when in reality, he had only committed the sin of living under an HOA that now wielded quasi-police authority. And it didn't stop there, because soon after he refused to pay those bogus violation tickets, the deputies returned at 2 a.m. to tow his truck off his own driveway, the sound of chains rattling and a diesel engine roaring waking him from sleep, and when he stumbled out in his robe demanding to know why, one of the deputies coolly said, "HOA enforcement order, sir," while handing him a laminated document with the HOA president's signature and the county sheriff's seal, and David's blood ran cold as he realized this was not a prank or a rogue act, but a coordinated enforcement partnership, the kind the local news had quietly reported on as a new bill in Texas and Florida, but most homeowners had ignored, thinking it would never affect them. And yet here it was at his doorstep, his property rights vanishing in the dead of night, his dignity being stripped away in front of his neighbors who peeked from behind their curtains afraid to intervene, and he could see it in their eyes, that same mix of fear and resignation. For they too had been harassed, some fined thousands for weeds growing near their mailbox, others forced to repaint their houses 3 times in a year because the shade of beige wasn't compliant, and now with deputies backing the HOA's commands, resistance seemed futile. But David was not a man who bent easily. His years in uniform had taught him to recognize abuse of authority, to smell corruption in the air, and as he stared at the sheriff's seal on that bogus order, he swore silently that he would not only fight back, but expose the entire rotten system for what it was, though he had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went, nor how dangerous the HOA would become once challenged, because within weeks the enforcement escalated, turning Lakewood Meadows into something resembling a police state more than a suburban community, with HOA patrols riding in marked SUVs equipped with sirens, body cameras and license plate readers, issuing citations at will, pulling over teenagers for reckless golf cart driving, detaining delivery drivers who overstayed the 15-minute parking rule, and even fining children for leaving bicycles on the sidewalk, each time with deputies at their side giving the veneer of legality to what were essentially petty neighborhood power plays. And the residents, once outspoken at HOA meetings, grew silent, terrified that speaking up might put them on the HOA's watch list, for rumors spread of black binders in the HOA office filled with violator profiles, complete with photos, vehicle registrations, and incident logs compiled not by police, but by the HOA board itself, and David knew if he didn't act soon, this experiment in private policing would spread beyond Lakewood Meadows, emboldened by profit motives and the promise of safer neighborhoods. until HOAs across America were running their own mini-governments unchecked, so he began documenting everything. He recorded body cam footage when deputies entered his yard without warrants. He photographed violation slips bearing both HOA and sheriff seals. He interviewed neighbors who'd been harassed, building a case file thicker than a phone book, and late at night, he would type up his notes under the dim light of his desk lamp, every keystroke echoing like a declaration of war. But the HOA noticed. Oh yes, they noticed. And soon their tactics shifted from petty harassment to outright intimidation. With HOA security SUVs parking outside his home at odd hours, their headlights flooding his windows, their radios crackling with coded chatter. And once, when he returned from grocery shopping, he found his lock drilled out and a new HOA-issued compliance lock installed on his front door, effectively seizing his own house from him until he marched into the board office demanding answers, only to be met by the smug face of HOA President Clarissa Monroe, a woman who wore pearls to board meetings and carried herself with the authority of a senator, though she was merely a suburban power broker. And she leaned back in her leather chair, smiled, and said, "Mr. Harmon, you can either comply with our rules or you can find another community to live in. We have the law on our side now," tapping the framed partnership agreement on her wall that bore both her signature and the county sheriff's. And David clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout, for he knew that losing his temper here would only give them more ammunition, and so he left. But not before vowing that if they wanted a war, he would give them one. And so began the battle that would turn Lakewood Meadows from a sleepy subdivision into ground zero for the fight against HOA overreach, a battle that would draw media attention, legal scholars, politicians, and even federal watchdogs once the scope of it became clear. But before that spotlight, before the nation paid attention, David would endure hell on earth right in his own backyard, for the HOA was about to unleash every tool in their arsenal to break him, and the first salvo came when he was pulled over on his way to work by deputies who claimed his tags were expired, even though they weren't, his vehicle impounded, and a $1,200 compliance penalty issued by the HOA, not the DMV, the paperwork stamped and filed in both county and HOA offices, as though the HOA had merged into the government itself. And that night, sitting in his now truckless driveway, David realized the fight ahead was bigger than just him. It was about every homeowner in America who thought their HOA was just a nuisance about lawn colors or Christmas lights, when in reality, it was morphing into something far darker, and as thunder rumbled over Lakewood Meadows that night, he knew the storm was only just beginning. The storm truly broke over Lakewood Meadows in the weeks that followed, for after David Harmon's truck was impounded under the guise of expired tags and compliance penalties, the HOA realized they had struck a nerve and doubled down on their authority, turning the community into something closer to a fortified compound than a suburban neighborhood, with new cameras sprouting atop every streetlight, HOA patrol SUVs circling like predators on a hunt, and uniformed deputies assigned exclusively to HOA enforcement detail, a title that had never existed before but now appeared embroidered on patches over their bulletproof vests. And the residents whispered among themselves about checkpoints being installed at the subdivision's entrances, where license plates were scanned and visitors interrogated about their purpose, a dystopian reality hidden behind white fences and rose bushes. And David, who had thought his documentation efforts would remain a secret until he had enough to blow the whistle, soon discovered the HOA knew everything he was doing. For one evening, as he sat at his desk compiling yet another log of harassment reports, a letter slid under his door, no knock, no sound of footsteps retreating, just the quiet hiss of paper on hardwood, and when he unfolded it, the words sent a chill through his bones. "We see you. Mr. Harmon, stop your crusade or you'll be treated as a hostile actor under HOA Law 12.7. Consider this your final warning." And though the letter bore no signature, it had the HOA seal and the sheriff's office logo side by side, as if daring him to challenge their newfound alliance. And that night he barely slept, listening to the hum of SUV engines idling outside, the occasional snap of a camera flash in the dark, the eerie sense that he was already under house arrest in his own home. Yet fear only hardened his resolve, for David knew that surrendering meant giving this twisted experiment legitimacy. And so he contacted a friend from his military days, a lawyer named Marcus Lee who specialized in civil liberties cases, and over beers at a dimly lit bar far from Lakewood Meadows, he unloaded everything: the impound, the citations, the surveillance, the deputized HOA patrols, and Marcus leaned in, eyes widening with every detail, finally saying, "Dave, this isn't just harassment. This is unconstitutional on a level I've never seen. If what you're telling me is true, they've blurred the line between private association and public law enforcement. That's not just abuse. That's a shadow government." And those words stuck with David, fueling his mission. And together they began preparing a legal strategy, one that would involve class action suits, media exposure, and possibly federal intervention. But before they could strike, the HOA escalated further, orchestrating what could only be described as a show of force, staging a full-scale compliance raid on 3 families accused of habitual violations, with deputies in tactical gear storming their homes at dawn, confiscating property like barbecue grills, lawn furniture, and even Christmas decorations, hauling them into trucks marked HOA property control, while Clarissa Monroe, the HOA president, stood at the scene with a clipboard, directing deputies. Like a general on a battlefield, her pearls glistening in the morning sun, and neighbors cowered behind curtains, some filming on their phones until HOA patrols ordered them to stop, threatening fines for obstruction of compliance operations. And the images burned into David's mind. Children crying as their bicycles were seized, a veteran neighbor forced to the ground in handcuffs for refusing to unlock his shed, deputies slamming HOA seals onto front doors as if branding them, and he knew the line had been crossed into outright tyranny, so he uploaded his documentation anonymously to a journalist he trusted, a young reporter named Sarah Whitmore from the regional paper, who had been sniffing around Lakewood Meadows after hearing rumors of police state HOAs. And when she saw David's files, her jaw dropped, for it was not just hearsay but photographic proof, video evidence, and written orders signed by both HOA officials and county law enforcement, and she promised to run the story. But before she could, the HOA struck again, this time targeting David directly with what they called an emergency compliance audit, where 6 deputies and 2 HOA board members showed up at his door with a warrant-like document and proceeded to search his home, rifling through his cabinets, snapping pictures of his garage, and even seizing his laptop under the claim it contained subversive HOA-related materials, a blatant violation of rights that left David trembling with fury, yet unable to physically stop them. And when they left, leaving his house in shambles, he knew it was war, so he doubled down, meeting Marcus in secret locations, sharing updates with Sarah via encrypted messages, and slowly building a coalition of residents willing to testify, though fear kept many silent, until one night, the HOA overplayed its hand by arresting a beloved 72-year-old widow, Mrs. Patterson, whose only crime was refusing to cut down her century-old oak tree, citing it as a threat to uniform canopy aesthetics, and when deputies dragged her away, in front of weeping neighbors, her wrists bound by plastic cuffs, something broke in the community. Whispers turned into outrage, and dozens began gathering at David's house, asking what they could do, willing at last to resist. And so, like an underground resistance movement, they began organizing, holding secret meetings in basements, devising ways to record HOA patrols, filing anonymous complaints, and distributing flyers that read, "We are not subjects," slipped into mailboxes late at night. And though the HOA increased patrols, installed more cameras, and threatened mass fines, the rebellion had begun, fueled by a sense of justice that could no longer be suppressed. And David, standing before his neighbors one evening, declared, "They may have the law on their side, but we have the truth, and if we stand together, we can take them down." And cheers erupted in hushed tones, fists raised, hope rekindled. But the war was far from over, for Clarissa Monroe was already plotting her counterstrike, lobbying county officials, framing the resistance as domestic agitators, and securing new enforcement contracts that gave the HOA even more authority. And when Sarah Whitmore's article finally broke, splashing headlines across state newspapers, HOA, police state? Lakewood Meadows residents claim abuse of power. The nation's eyes turned to the small suburb, but instead of shame, the HOA doubled down, hosting press conferences flanked by deputies, spinning tales of keeping the community safe from unruly elements. While Clarissa smiled for the cameras, a mask of benevolence hiding the iron fist beneath, and the county sheriff echoed her words, claiming partnership with the HOA was the future of community policing, sparking debates on news panels, talk shows, and social media, dividing the nation between those who saw it as an efficient safety measure and those who saw it as authoritarian overreach. And in the middle of this storm stood David, no longer just a homeowner, but the reluctant face of a movement, targeted by smear campaigns labeling him a troublemaker, his military record questioned, his credibility attacked, yet his resolve unshaken, for he knew that behind the propaganda was a truth too dangerous to ignore, and as federal civil rights investigators quietly reached out, hinting at a larger probe, David realized the climax was near. A collision course between the HOA's hunger for power and the residents' fight for freedom. A battle that would not only determine the fate of Lakewood Meadows, but set a precedent for every HOA in America. And as night fell over the subdivision, with patrol SUVs creeping like wolves under the glow of street lamps, David stood at his window, a man prepared for the storm to come, whispering to himself, "This ends now," unaware that the next move by the HOA would be their most audacious and dangerous yet. The sun rose slowly over the neighborhood that had become a battlefield between ordinary residents and the HOA that fancied itself a private police force. But this dawn felt different because it was no longer a struggle fought in silence, fear, or fragmented whispers among frightened families. It was now a full-scale reckoning, a climax forged by months of intimidation, secret recordings, daring confrontations, and a community slowly realizing that their collective power could dismantle even the most arrogant authority. And as James stood at his window looking down the street, he saw the last of the sheriff's deputies, men who had once parked their cruisers on his lawn at the command of HOA President Linda, driving away for good, their contracts revoked, their badges, once misused as weapons now stripped from the HOA's control, and for the first time in nearly a year, the air felt free of chokeholds and threats. Yet James knew the story wasn't finished because Linda wasn't the type to surrender quietly, and as predicted, she staged one final spectacle, calling an emergency HOA meeting in the lavish clubhouse, inviting not only residents, but media crews, lawyers, and even the county commissioner, turning what was supposed to be her desperate defense into a public trial of everything the HOA had become, and James attended with the weight of every violated, right on his shoulders, armed with documents, testimonies, and the knowledge that exposure was deadlier than any fine or fabricated arrest. The clubhouse was filled with a thick tension as Linda, dressed immaculately in her tailored suit, stood at the podium, attempting to frame herself as the protector of the neighborhood, a visionary who had only wanted safety and order, but every word trembled under the weight of the truth waiting to be revealed. And when she finished her speech, James rose slowly, carrying a stack of binders that contained the contracts, the hidden audio clips of her instructing deputies to target specific families, the videos of HOA patrols threatening kids for riding bikes, and the most damning piece, the whistleblower statement from a deputy who admitted under oath that Linda had bribed him with HOA funds to prioritize her vendettas. And as James laid it all out on the table, the cameras flashing, the commissioner listening intently, and the crowd murmuring with shock, Linda's face drained of color, her perfectly rehearsed composure shattering into panic. And though she tried to cut him off with shouts of, "Lies! Distortions! He's making this up!" the evidence was undeniable. The voices on the recordings unmistakably hers. The bank transfers tracked back to her personal accounts, and the HOA board members who had once sat loyally at her side began sliding their chairs away, unwilling to sink with a ship that had just struck an iceberg. And then came the twist no one had expected. Federal agents, who had been quietly monitoring the meeting from the back, stepped forward, announcing that Linda was under investigation not just for misuse of HOA funds and civil rights violations, but for racketeering, because the web she had spun went deeper than anyone imagined, involving kickbacks with private security firms, fraudulent billing schemes, and illegal surveillance contracts, turning what she thought was her last stand into the moment of her arrest. And as they led her out in handcuffs, the residents erupted, some cheering, others crying from relief, children hugging their parents knowing the nightmare was finally ending. And James, though exhausted, felt the burden lifting at last, not because Linda was gone, but because the people had seen the truth and reclaimed their neighborhood. And in the aftermath, the state legislature, pressured by the media firestorm, launched hearings into the dangers of allowing HOAs quasi-police powers, citing this community as the prime example of why private enforcement contracts threaten democracy at its roots. And weeks later, James found himself sitting in front of a microphone in a grand hearing room, testifying not just as a victim, but as a voice for millions of homeowners across the country, explaining how easily power can be abused when it hides behind the veil of safety and community, and how fragile freedom becomes when ordinary people believe they cannot resist. And his words echoed far beyond the chamber, igniting debates on television, in newspapers, and across kitchen tables, reshaping how America saw the future of its neighborhoods, while back home, the community began to heal, families reopening blinds they had kept shut, children playing freely in yards, and neighbors gathering not out of fear of inspection, but out of genuine fellowship. And in that simple rebirth, James saw the answer he had been fighting for, that communities didn't need self-appointed sheriffs or power-hungry presidents. They needed courage, unity, and the refusal to bow to manufactured authority. And as he walked the quiet streets, one evening, the sound of laughter echoing instead of the hum of patrol cars, he knew the battle had been worth every scar, every sleepless night, every confrontation, because they had not only dismantled a corrupt HOA, but had sent a message far beyond their subdivision, a message that said loud and clear, when HOAs act like police, it is not order they create but tyranny, and tyranny will always, eventually, be overthrown by the people it tries to silence.